The morning Inez Fletcher marched into the Calvary Baptist Church of Dusty Creek, Texas, and told Reverend Hobart Sims she would not be needing his services. The whole town held its breath for exactly 3 seconds before erupting into the kind of gossip that would fuel a dozen Sunday suppers. It was the spring of 1882, and Dusty Creek sat like a stubborn old mule at the crossroads of the Pecos Trail and the cattle drives that rolled up from San Antonio, a town of perhaps 400 souls wedged between the ambitions of the railroad companies pushing westward and the quiet dignity of the ranching families who had built something real from the hard red earth. The sun came down on Dusty Creek with a particular ferocity, as though it had a personal quarrel with anyone who thought life should be easy, and the dust that gave the town its name coated everything. The storefronts, the horses, the windowsills of the white-painted church that stood at the end of Main Street like a man who had seen too much and forgiven most of it. Inez Fletcher was 26 years old, with dark hair the color of good river mud, and eyes the shade of green glass when the afternoon light hit it just right. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches, which was not small but felt small next to the weight she had been carrying for the past 3 years. She had come to Dusty Creek originally as a bride, arriving on the stage from San Antonio with a trunk full of her mother's good linen and a heart full of cautious hope, marrying a cattle rancher named Douglas Fletcher, who had wooed her through a series of letters so beautifully composed that her sister had accused her of making them up. Douglas had been a good man, honest and hardworking, with rough hands and a laugh that came from somewhere deep in his chest. He had also been, as fate would arrange with its usual cruelty, not particularly long for this world. A fever had taken him in the autumn of 1880, and Inez had spent the 18 months since then learning that widowhood in the West was less about grief and more about survival, which was its own kind of grief entirely. She had kept the ranch. That surprised everyone, including herself. People had expected her to sell the land, go back to San Antonio, find another husband, or at minimum spend a reasonable period of time looking helpless. Inez had done none of these things. She had hired 2 ranch hands, a quiet Mexican man named Cesar who had worked for Douglas and understood cattle the way some men understood scripture, and a younger man named Billy Hatch who was 17 and eager and broke 3 fence posts for every 2 he successfully repaired. She had learned to keep the books herself and to negotiate prices at the stock auction without letting the buyers know. She had studied their faces for 2 full seasons before opening her mouth. The ranch had not thrived exactly, but it had not died, and in 1882 Dusty Creek, keeping something alive was its own kind of victory. What she had not done was attend church. This was not a matter of faithlessness. Inez had her own conversations with God, generally conducted at dawn on the porch with a cup of coffee, or in the middle of the night when the wind came down off the high plain and rattled the shutters, and she lay awake listening to the silence that Douglas used to fill. She simply found that the organized version of faith, the kind that happened in a building with a congregation watching, felt like putting on clothes that fit someone else. She had nothing against Reverend Sims personally. He was a harmless, well-meaning man who smelled faintly of the peppermints he kept in his vest pocket, and who had delivered Douglas's funeral service with genuine feeling. But when he had begun appearing at her door with increasing frequency over the past several months, bringing casseroles and Christian literature, and the thinly veiled suggestion that a woman alone needed the community of the church to keep her from going wrong in some unspecified way, Inez had decided that a direct conversation was kinder than continued avoidance. She had walked into the church on a Tuesday morning, when she knew it would be empty except for the Reverend doing his preparation work, and she had said, in the most polite voice she could manage, "Reverend Sims, I want to thank you for your concern, truly I do, and I think you are a fine man who does good work in this community. But I will not be needing your pastoral services, and I would appreciate it if you would save the casseroles for someone who actually needs them. I am quite well. I am managing just fine." The The Reverend had blinked at her with his mild blue eyes and said, "Mrs. Fletcher, the church is here for everyone, including people who believe they are managing just fine." "I know that," Inez had said, "and I mean no disrespect to the institution. I simply mean that I know my own mind and my own soul, and I would like to be trusted with the keeping of both." The Reverend had sighed the particular sigh of a man who has argued with the Almighty and knows when he is outmatched. "The door is always open," he had said, which Inez had taken as both a gracious concession and a warning. She had turned to leave, feeling the particular lightness that comes from having said a hard thing clearly, and that was when she noticed that the church was not, in fact, entirely empty. In the last pew, the one farthest from the pulpit, pushed so far back against the rear wall that it was half in shadow even in the morning light, sat a man she had never seen before. He was sitting very still, the way men sit when they are trying to take up as little space as possible, which on this particular man was a losing effort because he was broadly built through the shoulders with hands that rested on his knees like a pair of working tools set down temporarily. He wore trail-worn clothes, a dark coat that had seen better days but was clean, trousers tucked into good boots that had been resoled at least twice, and a hat he had taken off and was holding in both hands with a care that said he had been raised to remove his hat in a church, and intended to keep doing it regardless of whatever else life had done to him. His hair was dark with a thread of silver at the temples, and his face had the particular quality of a landscape that had weathered several serious storms and come out changed but not destroyed. He looked to be perhaps 30, possibly 32, though it was difficult to tell with men who had spent years in the open air. There were lines around his eyes that might have been from squinting into the sun or might have been from something harder. He was looking directly at her, not with rudeness. Not with the assessing look that men in cattle country gave a widow, which was a complicated arithmetic of property value and remarriage prospects wrapped in the disguise of sympathy. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something genuinely unexpected, with a kind of startled attention, as though he had been sitting in the quiet of the empty church thinking about one thing and the door had opened and the thing had walked in. Inez felt her composure do something entirely undignified, which was to briefly lose its footing. She recovered it immediately, as she had learned to do with most things. "I apologize," she said, because it seemed the right thing to say. "I did not see you there." "No need to apologize," the man said. His voice was low, with a slight roughness to it, like gravel that had been smoothed by water but still had its weight. "I was not announcing myself. Were you waiting for the Reverend?" "I was waiting for the quiet," he said, "though I suspect the Reverend will be along eventually." There was a beat of silence. The morning light came through the plain glass windows of the church and lay in yellow strips across the wooden floor. Outside, Dusty Creek was beginning its daily business, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the creak of wagon wheels, the distant instruction of someone who had lost patience with a mule. "Are you passing through?" Inez asked, which was the standard question in Dusty Creek for anyone not immediately recognized. "That is what I told myself when I rode in yesterday," the man said. "Whether it remains true is something I have not yet decided." It was a peculiar answer, and Inez found that peculiar answers interested her more than ordinary ones. "Well," she said, because she did not know what else to say, and because the conversation felt as though it wanted to continue but she had not planned for it, "I hope you find whatever you are looking for." "I hope so too," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, without irony or lightness, as though he meant it completely and had not yet given up on the possibility, that stayed with her as she walked out into the dust and the sunshine of the Dusty Creek morning. She did not ask his name. She thought about that on the ride home, the fact that she had not asked his name, which was strange because Inez Fletcher was not generally a woman who left information uncollected when it was easily available. She told herself it was because she had been distracted by the conversation with the Reverend. She told herself it was because she had other things on her mind, the spring branding, the fence line on the eastern pasture that Cesar had told her needed repair before the cattle pushed through it, the quarterly accounts she had been putting off since March. She told herself a number of things during the 2-mile ride back to the Fletcher ranch, and none of them entirely satisfied her. His name, she learned the following day, was Nelson Garrison. She learned it from Martha Pryor, who ran the dry goods store and knew everything worth knowing about Dusty Creek within approximately 6 hours of it being known. Martha was a cheerful and generous woman who treated information the way some people treated good cooking, as something meant to be shared liberally and without apology. "New man at Dooney's boarding house," Martha said, wrapping Inez's order of flour and dried beans with practiced efficiency. "Came in on Monday. Paid for a week in advance, which means he is either planning to stay or he is particular about his obligations, and either way I find it promising. Name is Nelson Garrison. Used to be a ranch foreman over near Abilene from what Tom Dooney says. Lost the position when the ranch sold to a railroad company, which is happening a great deal these days, more's the pity. He is looking for work." Inez filed this information away with the careful neutrality she applied to everything. "Is that so? He is a very presentable man," Martha added, with the sort of casual emphasis that was not casual at all. "Martha, I am simply noting what I observe, Inez. You are noting what you hope I will find useful. Those are not always different things," Martha said serenely and handed over the package. The thing was, the Fletcher ranch did need a foreman. This was a fact that Inez had been avoiding like a loose board in a floor she walked every day, knowing it was there, stepping around it, not dealing with it. Cesar was exceptional with cattle but had no head for the organizational side of running a spread. Billy Hatch was growing into a capable hand, but was still too young and too inexperienced to oversee anything. The ranch had 35 head of cattle and the potential for more if she could work the land properly, and she had been managing it through a combination of Cesar's instincts, her own stubbornness, and the sheer force of refusing to admit that she might be in over her head. She told herself for 2 days that she would not seek out Nelson Garrison about employment. She told herself she would place a notice at the general store as she always did when she needed workers, and whoever came, came. She told herself this on Wednesday and again on Thursday, and on Friday morning she saddled her mare, a steady chestnut horse named Clara who had belonged to Douglas and who seemed to regard Inez with a kind of resigned affection, and she rode into town. She found Nelson Garrison at the livery stable, which was where men with horses generally spent their mornings in Dusty Creek. He was brushing down a large gray horse with the focused attention of someone who takes the care of animals seriously, and he did not notice her immediately, which gave her a moment she had not asked for and made use of anyway. He was, in the honest assessment of morning light rather than the complicated light of an empty church, a striking-looking man. Not in the studied way of men who knew it, but in the way of something that had been made for a purpose and happened to be handsome as a byproduct. His hands moving across the horse's flank were sure and quiet, and the horse, which Inez could see was a large animal with a tendency toward nerves judging by the position of its ears, was standing easy. A man who could quiet a nervous horse was a man who understood patience. "Mr. Garrison," she said. He turned, and when he recognized her, something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, but the specific quality of someone who has thought about a thing and is now confronted with it in real life. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, which meant he had asked about her too. "You know my name," she said. "It is a small town," he said, and there was a slight smile in it, not wide enough to be presumptuous but present enough to be honest. "I understand you are looking for work," Inez said, because she was a direct woman and had found directness saved everyone a great deal of time. "I am. I have a ranch 2 miles east of town, 35 head currently, with room to expand if the management is right. I need a foreman. Someone who can oversee operations, manage the hands, handle the auction negotiations, and maintain the property." She watched his face as she said this, looking for the flicker she sometimes saw in men's expressions when a woman mentioned running her own property, the slight recalibration as they adjusted their expectations downward. She did not see it. "That is a substantial operation for one person," he said. "It is my operation," she said, making the emphasis clear without heat. "I make the decisions. I manage the books. I set the direction. A foreman executes, advises, and manages the day-to-day. He does not redirect." "That sounds like a sensible arrangement," Nelson said. She had expected negotiation or the slight bristling she sometimes encountered when the boundaries of authority were drawn before the job was even offered. She had not expected simple agreement. "The pay is $14 a month, room in the bunkhouse, meals," she said. "It is not extravagant, but the ranch is honest." "That is fair," he said. "You do not want to see the property first." "I would like to, yes," he said. "But I was going to say it is a fair offer regardless." She looked at him for a moment. "Are you always this easy to negotiate with?" "Only when the terms are already reasonable," he said. "I have no patience for negotiating against reason. I save my arguments for when they are actually necessary." She decided, in the practical way she decided most things, that this was a good quality in a foreman. She told herself it was the only reason she was pleased with the answer. Nelson Garrison came out to the Fletcher ranch the following Monday with his gray horse and a single saddlebag that contained apparently everything he owned, which Inez found either admirable or concerning, and eventually settled on both. He walked the property with her in a silence that was not uncomfortable, asking occasional precise questions about water sources and fence lines and the temperament of the cattle, and she answered them with the same precision. Cesar watched the whole process from a distance with the expression of a man who is reserving judgment, but is not entirely hostile. Billy Hatch tripped over a feed bucket in his efforts to appear normal and managed to send it clattering across the barn floor at maximum volume, after which he turned the color of a boiled beet. "The eastern fence needs immediate work," Nelson said, when they had completed the circuit of the property. "The post rot is more advanced than it looks. You will lose cattle through there before the month is out if it is not addressed." "I know," Inez said. "Cesar told me. Then you already knew. I needed someone who could fix it, not just identify it." He looked at her with that direct attention again, the kind that did not flinch away when it found her looking back. "I can fix it," he said. "Good," she said, and walked back toward the house, and told herself that the warmth she felt was satisfaction at a practical problem being solved. The first week was professional and efficient. Nelson worked from sunrise to past sunset, which was not unusual, but the quality of it was different from what Inez had observed in other hired hands, the way some men work because they are watched and others work because they cannot seem to stop. He fell into the second category entirely. The eastern fence was repaired within 3 days, properly this time, with cedar posts that would hold for years and wire strung tight enough to keep even the most ambitious steer from testing it. He reorganized the feed storage in a way that was so obvious in retrospect that it was slightly embarrassing, and he spent 2 evenings going over the herd records with a patient thoroughness that found 2 accounting errors Inez herself had not caught, which she acknowledged without embarrassment, because she was a woman who believed that the point of finding errors was correcting them, not defending having made them. What she noticed most, in those first professional days, was how easy he was to be around. Not easy in a blank or boring way, but in the way of something that does not create unnecessary friction with the world. He spoke to Cesar with a straightforward respect that did not condescend and did not exaggerate, and within a week Cesar had moved from reservation to something approaching approval, which was as high as Cesar's assessments generally went. He was patient with Billy Hatch's enthusiasm in a way that channeled it rather than flattening it. He never raised his voice to the cattle, which made them calmer than they had any right to be given the spring heat. And he did not treat the ranch as though it belonged to someone who did not know what they were doing. This was, Inez realized, rarer than it should have been. Most of the men who had passed through the Fletcher ranch in the past 2 years, whether as hired help or as neighbors offering assistance or as buyers inquiring about the cattle, had dealt with her with the slightly elevated volume and simplified vocabulary that men sometimes used with women in positions they did not expect women to occupy. Nelson spoke to her the same way he spoke to Cesar, as a person who had information he needed and judgment he respected. He asked her opinion and then actually listened to it, and when he disagreed with her, he said so plainly and gave his reasoning, and twice she had changed her decision based on what he said, and once he had changed his based on what she said, and neither of them had treated either outcome as remarkable. It was, she thought, on a Thursday evening in late April, sitting on the porch after supper with the last of the daylight going orange and pink above the flat horizon, a very pleasant way to run a ranch. He was still at the fence line. She could see his silhouette against the fading sky, moving with that deliberate economy of motion that was becoming as familiar to her as the shape of the land itself. She found herself watching longer than was strictly necessary before going inside. The social fabric of Dusty Creek, which was woven tight as any Eastern parlor despite the dust and the distance, was of course paying close attention to all of this. The opinions were as varied as the people who held them. Martha Pryor found the whole development entirely satisfactory, and said so to everyone who came into the dry goods store. Tom Dooney, who had lost Nelson's boarding house fees when he moved to the ranch bunkhouse, was philosophical about it. The Reverend Sims made no comment, which was itself a kind of comment. The cattlemen who traded at the Dusty Creek stock auction watched Nelson manage the Fletcher cattle at the spring sale with the careful attention of men assessing competition, and came to the conclusion that whatever was or was not happening at the Fletcher ranch, the cattle were well handled. The women of the church women's auxiliary, who met on Wednesday afternoons in the parlor of a woman named Eliza Hartwell, and who had been quietly hoping that Inez Fletcher would eventually be integrated into their social orbit, were divided. Some felt that a widow hiring a single man to live on her property was an invitation to scandal. Others felt that practical necessity was practical necessity, and that a woman running a ranch alone deserved not to be run into the ground by it. The discussion had the lively quality of an argument in which everyone is more interested in their own position than in reaching agreement, which was how most good discussions went. What Inez knew of all this she knew in the way you know weather is coming, by the particular quality of the air when certain people spoke to her, and the careful phrasing of questions that were not quite questions. She noted it and proceeded. What she had not noted, or rather what she was working very hard not to note in the way that careful avoidance of a thing is itself a form of noting, was the way May came in with its warmth and its wildflower smell and its long evenings, and how the long evenings began to contain something new. It started with conversations. This was not unusual. They talked every day about the ranch and the cattle and the weather and the price of hay. But somewhere in the third week of May, the conversations began to drift past the practical and into the wider world, the way a river, given the right geography, will overflow its banks without breaking them. He told her about Abilene, about the years he had spent there as foreman of a ranch that had been, he said with a quiet matter-of-factness, one of the best operations he had ever seen, built by a man named Calloway who had spent 30 years making something from nothing, and then sold it to a railroad surveyor for a sum that erased all the years at once. There had been grief in it that Nelson did not name, but that was present in the space between the words. She told him about San Antonio, about the house she had grown up in, about her mother who had been a school teacher and her father who had been a printer, and who had taught her that words were tools like any other, meant to be used for something useful. She told him about reading Douglas's letters, those beautifully written letters, and deciding to come west, and she was surprised to find that she could talk about Douglas without the particular bracing herself she usually did, as though the weight had not changed but the way she was carrying it had. "He sounds like a good man," Nelson said. "He was," Inez said. They were sitting on the porch steps, the way they had fallen into the habit of doing in the evenings, the day's work done and the night not yet requiring anything of them. I think about him differently now than I did right after. At first it was all the loss. Now I remember more of the actual person. That is how it should go, Nelson said. Did you lose someone? She asked, because there was something in the way he understood grief that suggested it was not theoretical. He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of unwillingness but the silence of deciding how to say something accurately. My father, he said, 3 years ago. He ranched near Fort Worth his whole life, and then the land went dry 2 years running and the bank took it. He did not outlive the loss by a year. I am sorry, Inez said. He was proud, Nelson said, not with bitterness but with the complicated tenderness of someone who has had to love a person's flaws as part of the whole. Too proud to ask for help before it was too late. I learned something from that. What did you learn? He looked at her, and the evening light was doing something to his eyes that she refused to think about with any precision. That pride is expensive, he said, and that asking for help when you need it is not weakness. It is just sense. She thought about her own refusal of the Reverend's casseroles and his pastoral concern, and wondered if she had been confusing independence with something that looked like it but was less useful. She did not share this thought out loud, but she sat with it in the comfortable way you sit with a thought that has decided to stay. June arrived like a judgment, with heat so solid you could lean against it, and with it came a piece of news that rattled through Dusty Creek like a stone in a tin pan. Elias Purdy, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county, a man of 60 with a reputation for business acumen and very little patience with anyone who was not Elias Purdy, had sent word that he was interested in purchasing the Fletcher ranch. Not purchasing it from Inez exactly. The letter that arrived at the ranch, carried by Purdy's foreman, a thin, unhappy man named Decker, was phrased in the language of opportunity rather than negotiation. It suggested that Mrs. Fletcher might find it prudent to consider her position, that a ranch of her size without adequate male management was a precarious enterprise, and that Mr. Purdy was prepared to offer a generous settlement. Inez read the letter twice, folded it, and set it on the table with the deliberate care of someone not throwing something they are considering throwing. Purdy, said Cesar, who had heard about the letter through the particular speed at which information moved among ranch hands, with a tone that communicated an entire history in 4 letters. You know him? Inez asked. He made an offer on the Fletcher land when your husband was sick, Cesar said. Mr. Douglas turned him down. He waited. This information rearranged several things in Inez's understanding of the past 18 months. She sat with it for a moment. He has been waiting for 2 years, she said. He waited on the Ramos family 4 years, Cesar said. They sold eventually. Nelson, who had been reading the letter over her shoulder without apology, said, he is counting on the assumption that you will eventually run out of the willingness to fight. Then he does not know me, Inez said. No, Nelson agreed, and there was something in his voice that was more than professional solidarity, something warm and certain, the kind of certainty that comes not from optimism but from actual observation. He does not. The response she sent back with Decker was polite and final. She had no interest in selling. The Fletcher ranch was not available. She wished Mr. Purdy well in his other endeavors. Decker received this response with the expression of a man who had expected it but was not pleased about it. Mr. Purdy will make another offer, he said. Mr. Purdy is welcome to do as he likes, Inez said. The answer will be the same. After Decker rode away, she went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular. The house was quiet. Through the window she could see Nelson at the corral, working with one of the younger horses, his attention entirely on the animal, patient and steady as ever. She had a sudden, clear thought, the kind that arrives without announcement and then makes its presence impossible to ignore, that this, the ranch and the work and the evenings on the porch and the man at the corral, was a life she was not willing to lose. Any part of it. She went outside to tell him about Purdy's likely next moves and found herself, instead, standing at the fence rail watching him work for a full minute before she said anything. He finished what he was doing, stroked the horse's nose, and came over to her with that unhurried walk that she had stopped noticing because it had become part of the landscape. "You are thinking about the Purdy situation," he said. "I am thinking about several things," she said. There was a beat, the kind that has weight to it. The evening insects were beginning their preliminary investigations of the air. Somewhere in the distance, a cattle dog was expressing an opinion. "What else are you thinking about?" he asked, and his voice was careful, the way a person is careful around something they want to handle well. Inez Fletcher was not a woman who flinched, but she felt the familiar pull of caution, the instinct she had developed over 2 years of being solely responsible for everything, to keep the parts of herself that were vulnerable well behind the parts that were capable. She looked at him and she saw in his face that same careful attentiveness she had seen in the church that first morning, that quality of a person genuinely waiting to see what the world would do next without trying to control it. "I am thinking," she said slowly, "that this ranch is the only thing I have built by myself, and that I am not going to let Elias Purdy's patience outlast my own." "That is a good thing to be thinking," Nelson said. And then, after a pause that was exactly the right length, "Is that the only thing?" She looked at him. "No," she said, "but the rest is more complicated." "Most true things are," he said. They stood at the fence rail while the sun finished its business with the day, and neither of them said anything more. But the silence was the kind that is full rather than empty. Elias Purdy's second move came not in the form of another letter, but in the form of a visit, arriving at the Fletcher Ranch on a Tuesday morning in late June in a fine black buggy that was conspicuously out of place on the ranch road. He was a broad man, still powerful despite his age, with white hair and the kind of face that had once been handsome and now expressed primarily the will to have things his way. He wore a good suit that was slightly too fine for a Tuesday, which told Inez everything she needed to know about what kind of meeting this was intended to be. He was also, she noticed, surprised to find Nelson Garrison at her side. "Mrs. Fletcher," Purdy said, with the practiced warmth of a man who had learned that warmth was useful, "I had hoped we could speak privately." "My foreman is present at all ranch business discussions," Inez said, with equal warmth and equal intractability. Purdy's assessment of Nelson was quick and thorough, the glance of a man who had sized up competition before. "Garrison," he said, which meant he knew who Nelson was, had possibly known before he came. "Mr. Purdy," Nelson said, with complete neutrality. The conversation that followed was a negotiation dressed as a courtesy call. Purdy raised his offered price, which was now genuinely generous, enough that a different woman in different circumstances might have felt the pull of it. He spoke about the difficulties of running a ranch without sufficient resources, about the uncertainties of the cattle market, about the wisdom of securing one's future. He was not threatening, exactly. He was reminding. He was painting a picture of difficulty and offering himself as the alternative to difficulty. Inez listened to all of it. She asked 2 precise questions about the offer, both of which had the effect of demonstrating that she understood the financial dimensions of what he was proposing perfectly well, and she watched him recalibrate his approach slightly with each answer. "My answer is no," she said at the end of it. "The same as last time and the same as next time if there is a next time. I'm not selling this ranch. I built something here and I intend to keep building it." Purdy looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the particular quality of a man who respects tenacity even when it inconveniences him, he gave a short nod. "You are stubborn," he said. It was not entirely a criticism. "I have found it useful," Inez said. He left. Nelson watched the buggy go and then said very quietly, "He will not come back." "How do you know?" "Because he respects the answer he just received more than the ones you sent in letters. He came out here to see if you would hold in person. You held." He paused. "He is that kind of man. He pushes until he finds the wall, and once he has found it, he moves on to where there is no wall." Inez considered this. "You know him." "I know men like him," Nelson said. I worked for a few of them over the years. There are worse kinds. That is a generous assessment. He has not actually done anything wrong, Nelson said. Pushy is not the same as wicked. He will leave you alone now. He was right, as it turned out. Purdy sent no third letter and made no further visits, and by August the whole situation had faded to the category of things that had been handled. What had not faded, and was in fact doing the opposite of fading, was the particular awareness that Inez carried with her through the days and evenings of that summer. It had a quality that was inconvenient, and also, she was beginning to admit to herself in the small private hours, entirely welcome. Nelson Garrison had stayed. He had not described himself as staying. He had paid for a week at the boarding house and then come to the ranch, and 1 week had become 1 month, and the month had become the summer, and he was still here, fixing what needed fixing and handling what needed handling and being, in the evenings on the porch, the kind of company that made the evenings feel like something to look forward to rather than something to get through. She noticed the specific things. The way he remembered, without being told, that she took her coffee black in the morning but wanted milk in the afternoon. The way he positioned himself between her and the sun when they were walking and checking fence lines, not with ceremony but with the automatic ease of someone who does things like that without thinking. The way he laughed, which was not frequent but was genuine, a low, warm sound that came from the same place as the rest of him. The way he looked at her when he thought she was not looking, which was the same way she looked at him when she thought he was not looking, an observation that had occurred to her on a Wednesday in July and had been sitting in the center of her chest ever since. The complication, the one she had identified on the fence rail in June without naming, was this: she had built something alone. The ranch was hers in the specific way that things you fight for are yours, with a weight and a meaning that things you are simply given never quite acquire. She had come to the West as someone's wife and become something else through the hard work of necessity, and that becoming was precious to her. She was not sure, in the rational part of her mind that she relied on heavily and trusted with great caution, that loving someone again was compatible with being the person she had become. She was not sure she could hold both things at once. It was Cesar, of all people, who addressed this without exactly addressing it. They were working together in the barn on a Saturday in late August, the kind of day where the heat was so heavy it sat on your shoulders, and Cesar was repairing a saddle with the unhurried competence he brought to everything. And without looking up from his work he said, in the quiet conversational tone he used for important things, "A good ranch needs more than one pair of hands." Inez, who had been counting the feed inventory, stopped counting. "I know that," she said. "A good life also," Cesar said, and finished his sentence and his thought simultaneously and returned to the saddle. She stood there for a moment with her inventory list and thought about all the things she knew and all the things she was afraid of and the distance between them. That evening, she told Nelson about the letters. Not Douglas's letters. She had told him something of those before, but her own, the ones she had written to her sister in San Antonio over the past 2 years, the ones in which she had been honest in the specific way you can only be honest in letters, because the person is not in the room. She told him what she had said in those letters about loneliness, which was not the loneliness of being alone exactly, but the loneliness of having no one to direct your thoughts toward, no one for whom you were, in the course of an ordinary day, specifically yourself, rather than just a person managing things. Nelson listened the way he always listened, with complete attention and without trying to shape what he heard into what he expected. When she had finished, he said, "I rode into Dusty Creek because I had nowhere particular to be and I needed to stop moving for a while. I sat in that church because it was quiet and I needed quiet. I was going to leave after a week." He paused. "Then I saw a woman tell a preacher she did not need his services, with more dignity and less cruelty than I have ever seen anyone deliver an unwanted message, and I thought I would like to know who she was." Inez looked at him. The porch was in shadow, the last of the light behind the horizon, and the stars were beginning. "And now that you know who I am," she said. "Now that I know who you are," he said, "I would like to stay knowing who you are if that is something you want." She was quiet for a moment, not because she did not know what she wanted, but because she wanted to say it right in a way that was true to all of it, to the ranch and the woman she had become and the cautious heart she had been keeping carefully behind the competent exterior for 2 years. "Nelson," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to tell you something true, and I want you to hear it without trying to reassure me out of it," she said. "All right," he said. "I am afraid," she said. "Not of you. Of the specific feeling of having something worth losing. I have managed the fear of losing the ranch because the ranch is something I fight for. It does not choose me back. You are a different category of thing." She stopped. "I'm explaining this badly." "You are explaining it exactly right," Nelson said, and his voice was the same voice he used with the nervous horse at the corral, steady and certain without demanding anything. "And I am not going to reassure you out of it. I am going to tell you something true back, which is that I have not stayed in one place for 3 years because I was afraid of the same category of thing. And I am sitting on this porch instead of being somewhere else because whatever I was afraid of, you have made it seem less large than it used to." They sat with that for a moment, two people who had both been carrying something and had just cautiously set part of it down. "We are very careful people," Inez said finally. "We are," Nelson agreed. "I think," she said, "that I would like to be slightly less careful." He reached over then, across the small, deliberate distance of the porch step, and took her hand in his, and held it with the same care he gave to the things that mattered, which was simply holding it, not making anything of it except what it was. She left her hand where it was. The summer turned toward fall, and the ranch and the people on it moved through the change of season together. The fall branding came, and with it, the full chaos of a working cattle operation at its most demanding, dust and heat, and the particular orchestra of noise that cattle produce when they are collectively displeased with whatever is being done to them. Nelson managed it with a competence that was by now entirely unsurprising, and Billy Hatch managed it with an enthusiasm that only knocked over two things and broke none of them, which Inez noted as genuine progress. Cesar worked alongside Nelson with the easy efficiency of two men who have figured out how to complement each other's rhythms without discussion. The evenings became something else. What had been conversation became also, gradually, proximity, and what had been proximity became the comfortable naturalness of two people who have decided to stop pretending that they are indifferent to each other's presence. She sat beside him rather than across from him. He brought her coffee in the mornings without asking, and she accepted it without making a ceremony of the acceptance. He touched her face once, on an evening in September when they had been talking for an hour, and the lamp had burned low, and she had said something that made him still with the sudden attention of a man struck by something, and he had reached up and touched her cheek with the back of his hand, just once, gently, and then taken his hand back, and she had sat with the feeling of it for the rest of the evening. He kissed her for the first time on a Friday in October, under circumstances that were entirely unromantic and were therefore perfect. They had been checking the water supply at the Eastern Creek, which had been lower than it should be because of the dry September, and he had been explaining what he thought needed to be done about it, and she had been following his reasoning and asking questions, and somewhere in the middle of a sentence about the possibility of extending the channel slightly northward where the water ran deeper, he had stopped talking and looked at her for a long moment, and then simply kissed her. The way a person does something they have thought about for so long that, when the moment arrives, they do it with complete certainty. It lasted no longer than a few seconds. He drew back and looked at her with that direct attention, waiting. "You stopped mid-sentence," she said. "I know," he said. "I was genuinely interested in the rest of the sentence," she said, and then she kissed him back. They stood at the Eastern Creek for another hour after that, ostensibly discussing the water situation. And the water situation was in fact discussed and reasonable decisions were made about it. but the quality of the hour was entirely different from any previous hour, lit from the inside by the particular warmth of something that has finally been acknowledged. October moved into November, and November brought with it cold mornings that crackled with frost and evenings that came early and drove the working day's end sooner than the summer had. The change in temperature brought with it a change in the life of the ranch that was both practical and personal, the animals moving slower, the work adjusting to the rhythms of the season, the bunkhouse acquiring a second wood stove that Nelson installed himself on a Saturday afternoon. It also brought, in the way that winters in small western towns always do, a drawing in of the social fabric, people moving toward fire and company, and the particular urgency of warmth. It was in November that Reverend Sims came to the ranch. Inez saw him from the window, and her first instinct was the same as it had been in the spring, a desire to find a very polite way to redirect the conversation. She went to the door instead, because she was no longer entirely the same woman she had been in the spring, and because some part of her suspected that she owed the Reverend at least an honest conversation. He came to the door with his peppermint smell and his mild eyes and his hat in his hands, which was, she noted, the same way Nelson had held his hat in the church last spring. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, "I am not here to presume upon your private affairs. I want to make that clear immediately." "Then what are you here for?" she asked, though not unkindly. "I am here because a member of my congregation told me something that I thought deserved saying in person," the Reverend said, "which is that you are a woman who has done something genuinely remarkable here, and that I was wrong to approach it the way I did, with casseroles and concern rather than simple respect. I came to offer an apology, not a service." Inez stood at the door for a moment. Then she opened it wider. "Would you like coffee?" she said. He came in and had coffee, and they talked for 40 minutes, and it was a different kind of conversation than she had expected. The Reverend Sims, freed from his role as the representative of institutional concern, was an interesting man with genuine curiosity about the world and a capacity for honest self-examination that she found unexpectedly appealing. He spoke about the community he was trying to build, not the enforcement of faith but the creation of connection, and she spoke about what connection had meant to her in the years since Douglas died, and somewhere in the middle of it, Nelson came in from the barn and was introduced, and the Reverend looked at both of them with the expression of a man connecting several things he had been wondering about. "I hope," the Reverend said, standing to leave, "that whatever the future holds, both of you know that the church is genuinely open, not as a corrective, just as a community." After he left, Nelson poured himself the remaining coffee and said, "He is not as bad as you made him sound." "I did not make him sound bad," Inez said. "I just said I did not need his services. And now," she thought about it, "now I think he was right that I needed community," she said. "I just needed to build it myself rather than have it delivered." Nelson sat down across from her with his coffee and looked at her with that warm directness. "I think you have been doing that all along," he said. December arrived, and with it a particular turning point. It was Nelson who brought up the subject, on an evening when the fire was going and the wind outside was doing the serious work of a plains winter, making the house feel like a deliberate act of warmth against the cold. He had been quiet in an unusually deliberate way for most of the evening, which was different from his ordinary quietness, and Inez had noticed and waited. "I want to ask you something," he said finally, setting down the harness repair he had been half attending to. "All right," she said. "I want to know if you would consider marrying me," he said. "I am asking plainly because I think plain is what you prefer, and I am asking now because I do not see any useful purpose in waiting longer when I know what I want." He paused. "But I want you to know that my asking is not about the ranch, and it is not about the practical circumstances, and it is not about what other people think should happen. It is about you specifically, and who you are, and the fact that every day I am in this place I am more certain that there is no other place I would rather be, because no other place has you in it. The fire was doing something small and bright in the grate. Outside, the wind moved through the dark. Inez sat in the circle of firelight with the words still in the air around her and felt something in her chest shift with the careful movement of something that has been guarded for a long time opening. "I have a condition," she said. "Tell me the condition," he said without hesitation. "The ranch stays mine," she said. "Ours if you are willing, but mine in the sense that I keep the authority over it. I built it and I have the knowledge of it, and I want to keep being a woman who built something and runs it. I will share everything, the work and the decisions and the life, but I will not disappear into someone else's enterprise again. I need you to understand that." "I understand it," he said. "I would not want it any other way. You would not be yourself any other way, and I specifically want you." "Then yes," she said, "I will marry you." He crossed the room and she stood to meet him, and when he held her it was with the particular quality of someone who finally gets to hold something they have been careful about, fully and without reservation. She pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the warmth of him and the solidity, and the ranch outside in the winter dark, and the years ahead of it, and thought that this was what it felt like when two careful people finally stopped being careful with each other. They were married in January on the 14th in the Calvary Baptist Church of Dusty Creek. Inez had gone back to the Reverend and asked him. She had said, "I told you in March that I would not be needing your services." She had paused. "I have changed my assessment." The Reverend had looked at her with his mild eyes and permitted himself what was, for him, a considerable smile. "I had hoped you might," he said. The church was not full. Inez had not wanted a full church. She had wanted the people who were genuinely there, which turned out to be Martha Pryor and her husband, Cesar with his hat carefully pressed into shape for the occasion, Billy Hatch in a collar that appeared to be causing him genuine physical distress, a handful of neighbors who had earned the description by being actual neighbors rather than just geographically adjacent, and the Reverend Sims himself, who was conducting the service with the careful dignity of a man who had been given a second chance and intended to make proper use of it. Nelson stood at the front of the church in the clean dark coat she had come to know and waited for her, and when she walked down the aisle in the best dress she owned, which was deep blue wool and suited her better than white had ever suited anyone, he looked at her the way he had looked at her in the last pew 9 months ago, with the startled attention of a man confronted with something genuinely unexpected, except that now it had the additional quality of joy. The ceremony was brief and honest. The vows were the old words, and Inez said them with full attention, because she had learned that old words could be worn smooth by repetition without losing their meaning, like river stones that are beautiful precisely because of what has passed over them. When it was done, when Nelson kissed her with the quiet certainty that was the signature of everything he did, Martha Pryor produced from somewhere a bottle of actual champagne, which provoked considerable delight, and Billy Hatch managed to get through the rest of the afternoon without breaking anything, which Inez noted in the category of exceptional achievements. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was cold and clear and full of the particular warmth of a house that has become a home through deliberate choice. Inez worked the ranch through the winter in the way she always had, but with the altered quality of work done alongside someone rather than entirely alone. They fell into patterns, the easy domestic rhythms that are built from 1,000 small decisions accumulating into something that feels inevitable, even though it was chosen at every step. He made the fire. She made the coffee. They talked over the account books at the table after supper. They argued about cattle prices with the engaged quality of people who genuinely respect each other's arguments. He deferred to her on the long-term decisions about the land's direction. She deferred to him on the immediate management of the herd. Neither of them called it division of labor, because it was never rigid enough for that. It was simply two people using their strengths without keeping score. There was one afternoon in February that she stored away in the category of things she returned to in her memory the way you return to a particularly beautiful piece of land. They had been working in the barn, the two of them, On a day when Cesar had gone to town and Billy was visiting his family, and the ranch was theirs in the specific way, it was sometimes theirs when no one else was around. The work had been quiet and companionable, and at some point Nelson had been behind her, reaching past her for something on the shelf, and he had paused there for a moment with his arm around her from behind, and his chin against the top of her head, and she had leaned back into him, and they had stood like that for a moment, very still, with the smell of hay and horse and winter cold, and the sound of the cattle moving in the stalls. And she had thought with absolute clarity that this was what she had been afraid of losing, this specific thing, and that she had it. Spring came back to Dusty Creek with its usual dramatic intention, the wildflowers first, then the grass, then the long days of warm work under a blue sky that went on forever. The ranch moved into a season that was meaningfully different from the one before, partly because of the work Nelson had done over the winter, the improvements to the water channels and the fence lines and the efficiency of the operation, and partly because Inez had made a decision in December that she was only now ready to act on, which was to expand the herd. The money was there, carefully accumulated in the bank in Dusty Creek, the result of 3 years of tight management and honest dealing. She had 20 animals she could add without overextending the pasturage, and Nelson had identified a seller near San Marcos with good breeding stock at a fair price. In April they rode together to the stock auction in Abilene, which was the largest in the region and the place where the serious buying happened, and they bought 14 head of quality cattle at prices that gave Inez genuine satisfaction, and drove them back to Dusty Creek over 4 days of trail that was dusty and long and entirely pleasant in the specific way that hard work done alongside someone you love is pleasant. They camped on the trail the way working people camped, practically and without ceremony, and the evenings around a small fire with the cattle settled and the stars overhead and Nelson beside her were evenings she would have been pleased to live through indefinitely. "This is what I wanted," she said on the third night, looking up at the sky over the Texas plain. "What specifically?" he asked. "All of this," she said. "The ranch that I built, the work that is real and matters. And someone beside me who sees the same thing I see when I look at it." She paused. "I wanted those things for a long time. I was just not sure I could have all of them at once." "You can," he said. "I know that now," she said. He put his arm around her and she rested her head against his shoulder, and they watched the fire and the stars and the shapes of the cattle settling for the night. And it was not a complicated happiness, but it was a thorough one. In the summer of 1883, Inez discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Nelson on a Sunday morning in June, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, and she did not build toward it but said it plainly in the way she said most things. His face did something remarkable when she told him, which was the opposite of controlled. It was open and bright with a feeling so unguarded that she had to look at him for a moment just to take it in. "Are you well?" he asked when he could say something useful. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am also not planning to stop working before you ask." "I was not going to suggest you stop working," he said. "You were considering it." "I was going to ask if you needed to adjust the workload," he said, with the careful accuracy of a man who has learned to choose his words well. "Which is different." "That is different," she allowed. "We can discuss adjustments as they are needed." He crossed the kitchen and sat down beside her and took her hand, and she felt the warmth of him and the particular way his eyes looked in the morning light, the way they always had and always would, she thought, because some things did not diminish with familiarity but only deepened. "I am extraordinarily glad," he said. "So am I," she said. Dusty Creek received the news of the pregnancy in the way Dusty Creek received all news of significance, with warmth and commentary in approximately equal measures. Martha Pryor was perhaps the most visibly pleased, and prepared a quantity of useful gifts that spoke to genuine experience and good sense, rather than sentiment. The Reverend Sims offered his congratulations with the unornamented sincerity that had become, over the past year, Inez's preferred version of him. Cesar, when informed, nodded with the expression of a man who finds the news both unsurprising and correct, and went back to work with what might have been a slight additional lightness in his step. The summer was warm and good. Inez worked the ranch into her 7th month, with the modifications to the heavier work that she and Nelson had negotiated with the same honest directness they brought to everything. He was attentive without being smothering, which she had established as the standard early on and which he had met without apparent difficulty, suggesting it was not difficult for him at all, but simply how he moved through the world with the people he loved. The cattle operation was flourishing. The herd expansion had worked as intended, the new animals integrating well and the pasturage managing them without strain. The accounts were, for the first time since Douglas died, showing a surplus rather than a careful balance. The baby was born in February of 1884, a boy, healthy and loud about it, arriving after a winter night that was extremely long and eventually triumphant. The doctor from Dusty Creek had come out to the ranch, and Nelson had remained in the house the whole time, closer than doctors of the era always approved of, but absolutely immovable about it, which the doctor had addressed by simply acknowledging the reality of the situation. When Inez held the baby for the first time, and then when Nelson held him, and she watched her husband's face in the lamplight of the bedroom, his arms very careful around this new small thing, she thought that this was the continuation of everything she had built, the ranch and the life and the love of it, all of it moving forward and becoming something larger than it had been. They named him Douglas Nelson Garrison, Douglas for the man who had been good to her and whose name was part of the history of this land, and Nelson because his father was Nelson, and the name suited the family it was joining. Baby Douglas was, from the beginning, an interested and opinionated person, which Inez found unsurprising given his parentage. He arrived at everything with the particular energy of someone for whom the world is entirely new and therefore entirely fascinating, and he adjusted the rhythms of the ranch to accommodate him in the way that babies do, without asking permission and without apparent concern for the disruption. Nelson had not known, until the baby came, quite how much he had wanted this. He had not let himself know, the way careful people do not let themselves want things they are not sure they can have. But now he had it, the ranch and the woman and the boy, and he found that the wanting, having been fulfilled, became something else, not an absence of desire but a presence of gratitude so large it was occasionally difficult to hold. The spring of 1884 brought the ranch into its 5th year under Inez's management, and it was a different ranch than the one Douglas Fletcher had left her. It was not different in its essential character. It was still a working cattle operation on the red earth of West Texas, still dependent on water and weather, and the particular stubbornness of people who refused to give ground to either. But it was larger now and better run, and the surrounding land and the people on it had a quality of purpose rather than mere survival. Cesar had been given an increased wage and a larger role in the management of the herd, which he received with the equanimity he brought to everything. Billy Hatch had grown into a competent hand who had stopped breaking things at approximately the rate he repaired them, which was progress worth celebrating, and had begun quietly courting a girl from the Harmon family, which everyone in Dusty Creek found extremely satisfying to observe. In the summer of that year, Elias Purdy came one more time to the Fletcher ranch, not to make an offer. He came alone, without the fine buggy, riding a plain working horse and wearing plain working clothes, and he came to the door with his hat in his hand. "I want to talk business," he said to Inez, who had come to the door with Douglas on her hip. The baby regarded Purdy with the frank assessment of the very young. "Then come in," Inez said, because she had decided some time ago that she could afford to be generous to people who had been less threatening than they were afraid of being. The business Purdy had in mind was not an offer to buy but a proposal to collaborate, a grazing agreement that would allow Purdy's cattle to use the Fletcher water rights during the dry summer months in exchange for a fee that was fair, and a commitment to support the Fletcher operations expansion into the northern pasture, which required more capital than Inez currently had available, and which Purdy had the resources to provide without feeling it. Nelson sat at the table across from Purdy and said almost nothing during the negotiation, which was, by this point, exactly what Inez wanted from him in a business meeting. He was there, which mattered, and he watched, which mattered, and his presence had the effect of making clear that any agreement reached would be honored by capable people on both sides. The agreement they reached was fair, written down in plain language that meant what it said, signed by all parties. Purdy stood to leave and looked at the baby and then at the two of them, and something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but adjusting, the way a man's expression adjusts when he recognizes that the world has moved on from the version he was operating in. "Good ranch," he said on his way out. It was not a compliment exactly. It was a recognition. From Purdy, it amounted to the same thing. After he left, Nelson looked at Inez across the table with Douglas reaching for everything within arm's length and said, "You enjoyed that." "I found it satisfying," Inez agreed, bouncing the baby. "There is a difference." "There is," he said, and the smile that crossed his face was the complete one, the one she had been watching accumulate over the years, built from 1,000 moments of quiet and work and conversation and love. The summer was long and good. The cattle operation expanded into the northern pasture as planned, the Purdy agreement providing the capital and the Fletcher management providing the intention, and by the end of 1884, the ranch had grown to a scale that would have been unimaginable to the woman who had stood at Douglas Fletcher's grave and tried to figure out if she could keep any of this alive. It was alive. It was more than alive. Douglas Nelson Garrison was walking by November, in the determined fashion of a child who has decided that crawling is an indignity, and the ranch accommodated this development as it had accommodated everything, by adjusting and continuing. Inez watched her son navigate the world with the same absorption that she watched everything, and found in it a particular joy that was unlike any other, the joy of something you made being in itself, a whole person with their own determination and their own path. At Christmas they had Cesar and Billy at the table, and Martha Pryor and her husband, and the Reverend Sims who had become, over the past 2 years, the kind of presence in their lives that Inez had once said she did not need, and had discovered she was glad of anyway, not for the services he represented, but for the man he was when he was simply himself. The table was crowded and loud in the best possible way, and outside the prairie was cold and clear under a sky full of winter stars. "Do you remember," Nelson said to her that evening, after the guests had gone and Douglas was asleep and the house had settled back into its own sounds, "what you said to me the first time we talked?" "I told you I hoped you found what you were looking for," she said. "You did," he said, "and then you left before I could figure out how to tell you that I might have just found it." She looked at him across the cleared table in the lamplight. "You had about 10 seconds to make that observation," she said. "I thought I was being politely brief." "You were," he said, "but I sat in that church for another hour thinking about it." She reached across the table and took his hand. "And now," she said. "Now I am not looking anymore," he said. "I found it." They sat at the table together while the lamp burned and the wind moved across the prairie and the baby slept, and the ranch was outside in the winter dark, alive in theirs, and the life they had built was present in every corner of the room, in the coffee cups and the account books and the harness hanging by the door and the small worn boots by the hearth. Inez Fletcher, who had told the preacher she would not be needing his services and had walked out of the church into the morning light, and found a man in the last pew who had been looking for quiet and found something else entirely, sat with her husband's hand in hers and thought about how strange and how fine the path was that had brought her here. She had come to the West as someone's wife and lost the husband and kept the land and built something from the bones of it, And then a man with a gray horse and a worn coat had come to her empty church on a morning in March and sat in the last pew and held his hat in his hands, and everything had turned, slowly and thoroughly and irreversibly, toward this. In the spring of 1885, Inez discovered she was expecting again. She told Nelson at the kitchen table, in the same plain way she had told him the first time, with her coffee and her direct gaze. His face did the same remarkable thing it had done before, open and bright and entirely unguarded. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said. "And before you ask, I am also not planning to stop working." "I was going to ask if you needed to adjust the workload," he said, with the careful precision that was, by now, one of her favorite things about him. She laughed, which she did more freely now than she ever had, and the sound of it went out into the morning kitchen of the ranch she had built from the dry Texas earth, and the sheer refusal to let things end when they still had something left in them. "We can discuss adjustments as they are needed," she said. He came around the table and held her, and she pressed her face against his chest, and heard his heartbeat and the early morning sounds of the ranch coming through the walls, and the baby making the particular sounds of a child who is awake and has an agenda, and the life they had was present and real and full, and it was hers, all of it, every hard-won and tenderly chosen piece of it. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1885 on a day of thin, cold sunshine, healthy and determined-looking from the first moment, with dark hair like her mother and Nelson's gray eyes. They named her Clara Ruth Garrison, Clara for the horse that had carried Inez through the years of working the ranch alone, because Inez believed in honoring the things that had carried you, and Ruth because it had been her mother's name, the school teacher from San Antonio who had taught her that words were tools, and that a woman who knew how to use them could build whatever she needed. The ranch in 1886 was a living thing, larger and more purposeful than it had ever been, running a herd of over 60 cattle on land that had been cared for the way you care for something you intend to keep. Cesar remained, as permanent as the fence posts, as essential as the water. Billy Hatch had married his girl from the Harmon family in the fall, and was building his own modest place on a plot of land he had saved for, which delighted everyone, and was celebrated with an enthusiasm at his wedding that embarrassed him considerably, and pleased him even more. The town of Dusty Creek had grown around the years as towns do, new buildings going up along Main Street, a school opening in 1883 that Inez had helped fund, and whose board she served on with the direct engagement she brought to everything she committed to, a bank that replaced the one in the next town as the center of the local financial gravity, the railroad coming within 12 miles in 1885. Which changed the cattle trade in ways that were mostly good for the ranchers who knew how to use the change, and mostly bad for those who didn't. It was a different world than the one Inez had arrived in from San Antonio with her mother's linen and her cautious hope. It was harder and more honest and more beautiful than she had expected, and she had built herself into it, and it had built itself around her, and the result was a life that was, in the truest sense of the word, her own. On a Sunday in the spring of 1886, Inez and Nelson went to the Calvary Baptist Church. Not for a service exactly, though the Reverend was there in his customary place with his peppermint smell and his mild eyes. They went because Douglas was 3 years old and had asked, with the earnest curiosity of a child who has heard the word many times and wants to know what it contains, what a church was. And Clara, 7 months old and carried in her father's arms with the particular ease of a child who has decided her father is a perfectly satisfactory mode of transport, looked around the interior of the old building with the interested gaze of someone who is taking notes. Nelson sat in the last pew. Inez sat beside him, Douglas between them, and looked up at the plain windows and the morning light coming through them in yellow strips across the wooden floor, and thought about a March morning 4 years ago when she had walked out of this building feeling light with the freedom of having said a hard thing clearly, and had looked back and seen a man in this pew, holding his hat in both hands, looking at her with startled attention. "What are you thinking?" Nelson said softly. "I am thinking about the last pew," she said. He understood immediately, because he was the kind of man who understood the things that mattered without requiring explanation. He reached over Douglas's head and took her hand, and held it with the same care he had held it the first time, on the porch steps in an August evening that felt like a long time ago and also like yesterday. The Reverend began the service. Outside, Dusty Creek was doing its Sunday business with the unhurried quality of a town that has figured out its own rhythms. The cattle on the Fletcher ranch were moving through the spring grass, supervised by Cesar with his usual quiet authority. The eastern fence that Nelson had repaired in his first week on the job was solid and unchanged. The account books on the kitchen table at home showed numbers that Inez had put there through years of work and clear-headedness, and the refusal to sell. Little Douglas, sitting between his parents in the last pew of the church, where his father had once sat alone looking for quiet and found instead the beginning of everything, looked around at the building with the interested eyes of a child who has not yet learned to take the world for granted. He would learn to work the land eventually. He would learn the accounts and the cattle and the particular stubbornness of the hard, red Texas earth. He would grow up knowing that his mother had built this from nothing and his father had come riding through on a gray horse and stayed, and that the two of them had made something that held. Clara slept in Nelson's arms with the absolute confidence of the very young, trusting entirely in the solidity of the person holding her. Inez looked at her family in the morning light of the old white church at the end of Main Street and felt, with the completeness of a person who has finished something large and good, the weight of all of it and the grace of it, the years of work and loss and stubbornness and hope, and the careful falling of one person toward another until the falling became a landing, until it became a home. She had told the preacher she would not be needing his services. She had walked out into the morning. She had looked back. And in the last pew, holding his hat in both hands, Nelson Garrison had been looking at her, and neither of them had known yet what that meant, but both of them had felt, in the particular honest way of people who do not lie to themselves about important things, that whatever it meant, it was the beginning of something. It had been. It was. It continued to be. In every morning coffee and every evening porch and every long day of work and every night of winter wind and every spring of new grass and every child's laugh in the kitchen of the ranch that Inez Fletcher had built from the bones of loss and the stubbornness of hope. It continued to be, completely and without reservation, exactly what she had always wanted and never quite let herself believe she could have. It was enough. It was, in all truth, everything.